Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're diving into something pretty big, the EPA.
The Environmental Protection Agency.
Exactly. And we're looking at this document, laying out like a conservative vision for it, trying to unpack their arguments and, what these changes could really mean. It's a lot to unpack, that's for sure.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, we're talking about the air we breathe, the water we drink.
It's huge.
This document really wants to shake things up. So to really get why they want these changes, we kind of need to go back, like way back to the 70s. Remember when pollution was so bad? The Cuyahoga River, an actual river, caught fire?
Multiple times, actually.
Yeah. It sounds crazy now, right? But that was the reality back then.
It was a real wake-up call.
Totally. And that's what led to the creation of the EPA in the first place, right?
Yeah.
Nixon started it in 1970. And then the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, all that followed.
And we saw some major improvements because of those actions, too.
Right, which is interesting because this document even acknowledges that.
Yeah.
So the big question is, why change it now?
Well, they'd say the EPA has gotten too big for its britches.
Mission creep.
Exactly. They argue it's become this top-down coercive force, especially under, liberal administrations. They say it stifles economic growth with all these regulations that don't even really solve the problems.
Okay, so where do they want to go from here?
Complete restructuring, that's their answer. They keep using these terms like cooperative federalism and limited government. Basically, they want to give power back to the states.
So states would have more control over environmental issues.
Exactly. Think of it like how states set their own speed limits.
But the federal government still builds the highways.
Right. The EPA would be more about sharing resources and expertise with the states rather than dictating everything from on high.
Interesting. But wouldn't that lead to like a patchwork of different standards across the country? Is that really effective, especially for something like climate change, which is a global issue?
That's definitely a big question. And then there's accountable progress, which is another one of their big things.
What does that mean exactly?
They want to see actual results, measurable improvements, not just a bunch of well-meaning rules like show us the receipts kind of thing.
So how do they actually propose to make all these changes? Like what would this restructuring look like in practice?
Well, they get into the weeds a bit. They talk about overhauling the administrator's office, maybe even getting rid of some offices entirely, moving others around.
Wow, a total shakeup.
Yeah, they even have these day one actions, basically. Executive orders a new administration could use to put the brakes on existing rules, halt grants, even potentially downsize staff right away.
It's like hitting the reset button.
Kind of. We're talking about a huge shift in how the EPA operates, with potential ripple effects on everything.
From funding to enforcement.
Exactly. And speaking of specific impacts, let's look at what they suggest for some key EPA offices. First up, the Office of Air and Radiation. This is where it gets really interesting, especially when it comes to climate change.
Okay, so what's their take on climate change?
Well, they argue that the EPA is too focused on it, that it's overshadowing their other responsibilities. They actually want to scale back or even completely get rid of regulations about greenhouse. Well, this document argues that the current definition is way too broad. They say it puts too many burdens on landowners.
Like farmers who have to deal with drainage ditches and stuff.
Exactly. They want to narrow the definition, which, might make life easier for them. But environmental groups are worried about pollution in smaller waterways. After all, what impacts a small stream can eventually affect the drinking water for a whole lot of people.
It's that whole interconnectedness thing again.
Right. And it highlights the difficult trade-offs involved in all of this.
It's not always cut and dry, is it?
Definitely not. Now, here's where it gets a little surprising. While they generally want smaller government and fewer regulations, they actually support giving more money to one particular program in the Office of Water. The Clean Water Act needs survey.
What does that do?
It helps figure out how to allocate federal funding for things like fixing water infrastructure, all those crumbling pipes and outdated systems we hear about.
Makes sense that they'd support that if they want to see tangible improvements.
Exactly. They argue that by properly funding the survey, we can ensure those limited federal dollars are actually being used effectively, where they're most needed.
So it's less about ideology, more about practicality.
That's the idea, at least. And this focus on efficiency and, shifting responsibilities also comes up when they talk about the Office of Land and Emergency Management. They handle stuff like cleaning up Superfund sites.
Those contaminated areas.
Yeah. They want to shift the focus of this office away from creating new policies and towards what they call project management.
So more about getting things done on the ground.
Exactly. They want to make the cleanup process more streamlined, more efficient, and less expensive. Plus, they want to give states and tribes a bigger role in managing those cleanups on their own land.
There's that local control idea again.
Yep, it all comes back to that. But it does make you wonder if states and tribes have the resources and, the expertise to deal with something as complex as a Superfund cleanup, especially when you're talking about really hazardous stuff.
That's a good point. It's one thing to manage a park, but dealing with hazardous waste is a whole different ballgame.
Absolutely. And it raises a lot of questions about how this shift would actually play out in the real world. Would it lead to faster cleanups, or would it create more problems than it solves? It's something to think about for sure.
And you can't really talk about the EPA without talking about, science, right?
Mm-hmm.
How they use it to make decisions.
Absolutely. And this document does not hold back on that front.
Oh, really? What do they say?
Well, they claim that a lot of the EPA's scientific work is driven more by ideology than, hard data.
Interesting. So what do they want to do about it?
Transparency is a big one. They want the EPA to be much more open about how it does research and uses it.
So, show their work, make their data public.
Exactly. Especially when it comes to studies that haven't been made public or use data that's hard to access.
Makes sense. If you're going to base policies on science, that science should be solid and accessible, right?
Exactly. And then there are the EPA's advisory committees.
Those are the groups of experts who give the EPA's scientific advice, right?
Right. But this document argues that these committees are often stacked with people who already agree with the EPA's agenda.
So not a lot of diverse viewpoints.
Not really. And they say that lack of balance undermines the scientific integrity of the advice the EPA is getting.
That's a good point. So what do they propose instead?
They want a complete overhaul of these committees, more geographic diversity, representation from different stakeholders.
Not just academics and environmental groups.
Right. They want to see people from communities, from industries, a wider range of perspectives.
That makes sense. Get everyone at the table.
Exactly. And here's an interesting idea. They suggest giving more weight to citizen science.
What's that?
So imagine community groups collecting their own environmental data or, looking at the EPA's research for flaws.
Like a grassroots approach to science.
Kind of. It's an interesting idea, but it does make you wonder about, data reliability and stuff.
Yeah, how do you balance openness to citizen input with maintaining, the scientific rigor of the EPA's work?
Right, that's a tough one. But, it's an example of how this document really tries to challenge the status quo.
Shake things up a bit.
Exactly. And they apply this same scrutiny to a bunch of different offices within the EPA. Like, for example, the American Indian Office.
Which deals specifically with environmental issues affecting tribes, right?
Right. And the document actually emphasizes how important that office is. They really stress the government-to-government relationship between the U.S. and tribes.
So it's not just about environmental protection, but also about respecting tribal sovereignty.
Exactly. Empowering tribes to manage their own environmental programs. And they actually propose elevating the American Indian Office, making it a standalone office with its own assistant administrator, reporting directly to the EPA administrator.
Wow, that's a pretty big deal, right? Giving them more autonomy.
It is. And get this, they even suggest moving the office closer to the tribes they serve, out to the American West.
Interesting. Be closer to the action, so to speak.
Right. It's all about, recognizing the unique challenges that tribes face and making sure their voices are heard.
So from potentially scaling back certain regulations to empowering specific offices, this document really covers a lot of ground.
It does. And they don't shy away from, taking on some of the EPA's legal work either, like with the Office of General Counsel, the OGC.
They're the EPA's lawyers, right?
Yeah, they interpret environmental laws, advise the agency, represent them in court, all that. And the document really gets into the weeds on some complex legal issues, particularly around environmental justice and civil rights.
Okay, so how does that fit into all of this?
Well, they argue that the Biden administration has been interpreting those legal tools too broadly, overstepping their boundaries.
Can you give me an example?
Sure, like with Title VI.
Yeah.
It's a law that prohibits discrimination based on things like race or national origin in programs that receive federal funding.
Okay.
So the document suggests that the EPA might be misusing that law to push their agenda.
Interesting. And they connect this to the Supreme Court case about affirmative action.
Yeah, the Students for Fair Admissions case. They argue that the outcome of that case could have a big impact on how the EPA addresses environmental justice going forward.
So environmental issues tied up with these bigger legal debates.
Exactly. And because of that potential shift, the document calls for like a pause and review of all the ongoing environmental justice and Title VI actions the EPA is involved in.
So they're advocating for a more cautious approach.
Exactly. They want to make sure everything's in line with whatever the Supreme Court decides. And they also criticize what they see as inconsistencies in the EPA's legal positions, like different offices saying different things.
A lack of a unified front.
Right. And to address that, they suggest putting all the EPA lawyers under the Office of General Counsel, centralizing things a bit.
Interesting. Streamlining the legal side of things.
Exactly. But it's not all about legal battles and big picture issues. The document also dives into some of the nuts and bolts stuff, like the Office of Mission Support.
That's the one that keeps the lights on, right?
Yeah, they handle all the behind-the-scenes stuff, contracts, grants, IT, human resources. And this document really focuses on their grant-making process.
Which is a lot of money, right?
Yeah.
Billions of dollars every year.
Exactly. And they argue that those grants are often awarded based on, ideology rather than actual need.
So they want to make sure those taxpayer dollars are being used effectively.
Exactly. They want more scrutiny of how the money's being spent. They even suggest capping certain types of grants and implementing a stricter review process overall.
So it's about making sure that money goes to projects that deliver real results, tangible environmental improvements.
That's the idea. And then there's the Office of the Chief Financial Officer, OCFO.
The budget folks.
Right. And the document basically suggests making their operations more efficient, maybe consolidating some things. They also want more budget transparency, making it easier for everyone to see where the money's going.
So less bureaucracy, more accountability.
Exactly. And they even get into things like travel policies and reimbursements. They want the EPA to be more careful about spending, prioritize cost effectiveness.
Like any organization should, right?
Right. It's about being accountable for how taxpayer dollars are spent. Looking back at everything we've discussed, it's clear that this document really wants to shift power away from the federal government.
It's a recurring theme, for sure. Like with giving states more control, emphasizing local solutions.
Exactly. It's at the heart of this cooperative federalism idea they keep bringing up.
Right. And it goes beyond just the EPA, too, doesn't it? They want other federal agencies, like the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Energy, even Transportation, to be more in sync with the EPA.
Especially on big issues like energy, emissions, infrastructure, that kind of thing.
It makes sense on paper, but I imagine coordinating something like that across so many different agencies would be incredibly difficult.
Oh, absolutely. Lots of potential for, roadblocks and competing priorities. It's not as simple as just saying, hey, everyone work together.
Right. It's a massive undertaking. Well, we've covered a lot today. We've talked about the EPA's history, how it's structured now, and these pretty radical ideas for changing it.
We've been through a lot of information.
We have. So before we wrap up, I want to bring it back to our listeners. What does all of this actually mean for them? Why should they care about this debate over the EPA?
That's the key question, isn't it? And I think the answer is pretty simple. The EPA's work affects everyone. The air we breathe, the water we drink, the land we live on. These aren't just abstract concepts. They're the foundations of our lives.
Exactly. And the decisions the EPA makes, the rules they create, they have a very real impact on our health, our environment, even our economy.
And it's not just about the environment in isolation either. It's about balancing those concerns with other things like economic growth, individual freedoms. These are complicated issues with no easy answers.
Which is why it's so important for everyone to understand the different sides of the debate, right? To think critically about the trade-offs involved and inform their own informed opinions.
Absolutely. This document we've been discussing, it's just one perspective, a conservative vision for the EPA. But it's part of a much bigger conversation that's happening right now about the role of government, the best way to protect our environment, all these really fundamental questions.
And that conversation is going to continue long after we finish this episode, right?
Oh, definitely. And that's really my biggest takeaway for our listeners. Stay curious, keep learning, keep asking those tough questions. Don't just accept easy answers. Engage with this debate because it affects all of us.
Because at the end of the day, we all want the same thing, right? A healthy environment and a strong economy. Finding that balance, that's the challenge.
It is. And the more informed we all are, the better equipped we'll be to meet that challenge.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
So as always, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time for another fascinating conversation.